Listen up now, and leave on. Get ready for Arcade Bookshop.
Welcome to Arcade Bookshop, your podcast about video games and their literary counterparts for all of you who love to play and to read. Thanks so much for listening and joining us today. I'm Bryce Yoli, and as always, I'm here with my pal and cousin-in-law, Caleb James. Today is another special feature episode because we're also joined by Nicolas Obregon, author of the Inspector Iwata novel series, beginning with Bluelight Yokohama. Thanks for coming on, Nick.
Thank you for having me, gentlemen.
So you've talked with Caleb a number of times on the Drunken Pen Writing podcast. Caleb's been talking to me about you since I think the very first day that we met.
Cheers to that.
He raves about your writing, and I'll be honest, I haven't had a chance to read Bluelight Yokohama yet, but it's been on my Christmas list for 2 years. So,
if I had a pound, or I guess $1 for every time I heard that, then I would be richer than I am today. But no, man, I appreciate that a lot, and it's lovely to speak with you guys because, like I said off air, the concept of this podcast excites me personally, and also Caleb's a stand-up guy, great guy, so it's always fun to chat.
Yeah, and I also said to you in response to that off air, I really appreciate that because it's like I said, it's just been people have kind of warned me on the concept of this show a couple of times, just the way the algorithm works, doing two subjects in one show doesn't necessarily get us out there. But I appreciate it every single time someone actually acknowledges that it's a cool idea to bring two things together and not just focus on one thing. Because,
For sure.
like I said to you, it's like it's sort of becoming a problem that everyone can only do one thing and get popular or trend for only doing one thing. So it's
boring.
It's cool to be able to bring two communities together and two subjects together and have people join in on the conversation about it.
Well, I think especially when we talk about art, for me, I mean, we'll get into this later on, I'm sure, but for me, I don't see like a black and white binary between like video games and then like literature, right? Like, sure, it's two separate mediums, but, enjoying story, right? Enjoying imagining worlds, they always, hold hands, so yeah, it's different media, but they're kind of, there's a natural kind of DNA that's shared there. So that was kind of, it was one of the things that jumped out about me when I first saw your podcast, was that what a cool thing to bring together two things that lots of people love. And so, yeah, the algorithm maybe doesn't love it, but then the people who are going to listen to it probably do, right? So, right.
As soon as I can, as at the moment that those people that are actually interested in the concept can find it. So that's why I'm trying to, haven't done a lot yet, but I'm trying to do more things in public, like actually tell people what it is and get out there that way. And we'll talk more about the blend of the two bit, but just because our audience isn't necessarily all from DPW, do you want to talk a little bit about your origins, like something in particular I'm interested in that you may not have talked about on his show? I'm not sure, but I was looking at your bio and stuff, your travel writing experience, because that's something that even in like high school, I think, maybe college, I had an interest in, but traveling has always been really intimidating to me. And I only went out of the country one time. So traveling alone, let alone doing it as a job, is like a scary idea to me. So interested to see what your experience was like.
Yeah, man. So that's kind of like one of those jobs where, I don't know, man, like I would have been in my early to mid 20s when I got that job, maybe like 24. And I remember like I'd go to the pub afterwards and you get talking to like a random person. And of course they say, what do you do? And there would always be that moment where you'd be like, well, I'm actually a travel writer. And they'd look at you like bullshit. Like, are we allowed to swear on the?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. They'd be like, bullshit, you're not, right? Like it's like a talented Mr. Ripley type thing you're saying. I remember, so they sent me to Venice, I think maybe the second year. And coming into the airport, the like carabinieri guy, the policeman guy was like, so are you here for like business or pleasure? And I was like, business. And he looked at me like, no, you're fucking, like, you're like 24, man. Like, that job came about really randomly. I finished my studies. I traveled around a bunch, and now I was back in the UK, and I needed to make some money. So I just went to like an employment agency, and they sent me to a few places, and I ended up in the kind of the admin part of what was this magazine. And then I was singing to myself in Spanish in the kitchen, and the editor of the travel because there were different magazines. So the editor of the travel magazine came in. She said, "Oh, you speak Spanish. Why don't you apply for this secondment for 6 months to help out in the travel section of the magazine? It's cool that you speak languages and you write." So I did that, and then a couple of years later, they were sending me to Japan, and that's how I kind of where I first encountered this cold case of a family that were murdered. And then sort of by the time I was 30, that was my first novel, loosely based on the kind of real elements of that unsolved cold case, which then became my second book, my third book, and a podcast. And now I do it for a living, man. So look, the moral of the story is, man, if you've got a song in your head, sing it, because you never know who will appreciate hearing it, man, unless you can't sing.
Yeah, it's cool when things kind of happen by chance like that. We talked a little bit when you first reached out about some of the the brief travel that I did. I commented on one of your photos or whatever. And a guy I work with also, he went to Japan last year, and he's going again. He's traveling right now, going back again.
Oh, sweet.
And it made me start thinking, oh man, people are talking about Japan so much. It's actually like if I went to Japan, that would be super relevant for the show, because it's like the hub of video games. And also, I'm familiar with you writing about Japan, and I've read a little bit of Murakami that I really enjoyed. So I started looking into traveling, and I'm not going to Japan just because the flight's so expensive, but I did book a flight to Iceland by myself. So it's the first time traveling alone ever.
That's sweet.
And
I mean, Iceland is a great, I love it there. I've only been once, but yeah, man, it felt like going to another planet, like it was some sort of, lunar type experience. And it really just felt like, I don't know, the beginning of Prometheus is filmed there, right? And you kind of get why when you get there. I don't know, man. Like for me, I started traveling pretty young, but like when you are from Europe, and like my parents are from two different countries, so I grew up with languages and different, I was traveling back and forth between Spain, the UK, France since the beginning. So those differences culturally and linguistically always seem normal. So by the time you hit 18 and it's time to travel around and backpack, you're like, yeah, fuck it, I'll go to Brazil or whatever. Because it just kind of, one, it's not so far away because you've traveled already. And then two, I knew that the world was big, and I knew that I was a kid, and that the way that I would get hairs on my chest, the way I would get life experience was to go out and travel. Parts of it were with groups of friends, but mainly it was by myself. And honestly, like even the bad experiences, even the stuff that hurt, in the end was good, because it really does make you, I don't know if you're like a better person, but it makes you a bigger person. So like I had this with one of my best friends. He's from Buffalo. Did his first big journey to Japan in 2019, and I could just see it in his face, man. It was like a little kid on Christmas. He was just like the world was opening up in front of him, and it reminded me of where I was when I was young, and I was sort of first reaching out to the world. Because I think in the end, man, when you reach out to the world, it reaches back out to you, and not that you can't get that at home, but I don't know, it just feels like you're kind of, you're like existing in a way, So look, it's a bunch of cliches, but you'll love Iceland, and you should go to Japan if you get a cheap flight, especially one with stopovers. You'll find one, man.
Yeah, it's definitely something that I want to check off my list at some point. Yeah, and you're talking about how you're kind of already sort of close to. It's not as far for you to travel. As I never thought about it until recently, but I saw something on social media where this guy was like, "I understand now why Americans aren't as well traveled as most other people. It's because America is actually very large compared to most other countries, and if you're somewhere in or near Europe, it's it's kind of like just traveling across the United States to get to all these different countries.
Right.
So it's probably like once you kind of jump out of your country of origin, I imagine you would agree that it's kind of just like, well, I'll just keep doing it then. It's not even that big of a deal.
Right. Yeah, for sure. Once you get the taste of it, you just want it more and more for starters. But it's a lot easier to get those first experiences. Like, for example, when I flew to Venice, I think that flight was £12 returns. It was like $15 return, right?
Wow.
So look, that's like with no luggage, and there's a bunch of like, I don't know, like if your backpack is 1 inch too big or whatever, you get, it's like one of these budget shitty airlines. But the point remains, you can do this in Europe, especially sort of, I'm talking sort of 10, 15 years ago, when the kind of low cost flights boom really kind of like starts picking up speed. The deals were crazy, man. It was like, London to Dublin, £1 return, like with this promotional shit where, so I think, as you say quite rightly, number one, it's just, you're right there. Europe is roughly the same size as the US in terms of like a landmass, maybe a bit smaller, but that's 27 odd countries, right? Within the EU. And then there's more that aren't in the actual union itself. So, for example, man, like if I'm in the middle of London, I can get on the train and I can be in Paris, in the center of Paris, in 2 hours, right?
Mm-hmm.
So then from there, the whole of Europe is right there. In the US, like when I was living in LA, there were days where it would take me to drive from downtown more than an hour to get to Santa Monica, and I'm still in the same fucking city, man. So it's just the scale is completely different, let alone the fact that in America, like even in LA, you could go to the beach in the morning and in the afternoon you can go skiing if there's snow up in the mountain, and then you can cross those mountains and you can go to the desert and be in a hot tub in the desert. So that's all there in a way that we don't have that in Europe, right? In the same way. So there's always like a for and against. The thing I find really addicting, man, is like going to these new places, seeing how people live. I don't really care so much about like the tourist attractions. For me, man, I just want to see how like the local guy goes to get his coffee, just watching people just living out their lives. That to me is like that's the good stuff for me, man.
Yeah, I would
I like
agree,
your
yeah.
mullet watches on your stories on Instagram.
Well, for all those who don't follow me, for all those who don't follow me, Obregon Books, I do a thing where if I see a guy with a bad mullet, I take a photo of it and it goes up on the stories. I kind of respect the balls though, man. Like to have a mullet, it's a statement, and I respect that statement.
The Spaniards seem to go hard on the mullet still, which I appreciate.
For sure, man. There's a particular kind of subset which is like black band t-shirt and a mullet, and sometimes a mullet with a rat tail, sometimes like a mullet with a dreadlock. It's doing something. I don't know what, but it's doing something.
Well, so you based your novel series largely on your experience in Japan mainly, right? So do you have many other experiences in other countries that you write, I don't know, stuff that hasn't been published yet?
Yeah, so I mean, I wrote the Inspector Iwata trilogy, which is about a Japanese detective. So both his parents are Japanese, but then he kind of gets adopted later on by his mum's partner, and he's an American. So Inspector Iwata, at the age of like 15, leaves Japan and goes to Southern California, and so he has this dual experience of Japanese and American. So he kind of grows up between the two worlds, and that was directly that was directly an opportunity for me to talk about growing up between two cultures and two languages. And of course, America and Japan are different, but it gives you so much to be able to be bilingual, and not just in terms of the language, but to know how people live, to see how it works, to get it. That gives you so much. In the case of Spanish, it's a gateway to an entire continent. All of Mexico on down. You can get by and you can meet people and make friends and the rest of it. So, but not just that. It's also like a kind of passport to the world. The downside is that when you're from two places, you sometimes feel like you're from nowhere. People would say to me, "Where are you from?" Right? Because I've got a London accent but a Spanish name. And so when I was in the UK, people would call me the Spaniard, and then when I'd come back here in Madrid, they'd call me the Englishman. So it's like, well, so where am I from, right? So in a way, you kind of, especially when you're younger, I think you can maybe have that jealousy of people who are just like, I'm from fucking Idaho. I'm American. That's it. I was always kind of jealous of that simple life. So, yeah, man, in terms of like experiences in other countries, I spent a bunch of time in Japan back and forth. I spent some time in South America, and then I lived for 6 years in the US. So my second book is based between Japan and Southern California, and it gets into northern Mexico because, minor spoilers, there's some involvement with the people who cross the border and that kind of whole netherworld. Because for me, man, like my favorite thing is to see how people live a certain way and then to feel like I'm going to try and tell my story, but I'm going to try and do it in a way that feels real and credible, right? Even if it's not necessarily mine, I think I can get it. That for me is the biggest challenge as a writer. Does it feel on some level real? And if it does, then it makes the reader feel like it makes them feel something. And making the reader feel something is the whole ball game for me. I don't need prizes. I don't need good reviews. I just want the readers to pick up the book and have one feeling, whatever that is. And if they feel it, my job is done.
Do you think, since you're writing a lot about like what people are like in different cultures and things like that, there was someone, I don't know, I forget who it was at this point, but there was someone in college, a teacher or something, who said they've never met a successful writer that had no life. Do you
Right.
do you agree that, or I don't know if do you agree is the right preface to that, but do you think that travel is necessary for a writer to write like and understand other people well enough?
I think that, look, if language is the building block of anything that we do, right? Like that's kind of the arrogance of what it is to be a writer, where it's saying, look, some of us do karate, some of us don't. Some of us are good cooks, some of us are not. We all have language on some level. So when you say I'm a writer, you're saying these fundamental building blocks that we all play with, I'm a master. Right? So we all do them, but I do them really well. So I think you kind of have to, just by the very nature of saying, listen to my story, it's worthwhile, you really have to come at it seriously. And I think to communicate successfully on any level, you can't just talk about what you know. This idea of write what you know, of course, I'm not saying it's wrong, and it will feel authentic when it's authentic, right? So I'm not saying it's wrong, but also, I don't know, like Agatha Christie isn't fucking Belgian, and she writes Poirot, right? Like you don't need to be the thing to write the thing. So I think if you do travel, I think it makes you better at communicating, full stop. And I think if you're a better communicator, you're more likely to be for that to translate into better storytelling. So I would agree with that statement for sure. I'm not sure if necessarily it makes you like a better writer if you're already a bad writer, but it's not going to make you worse. If that, I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah, probably.
Sure.
It depends on the stories you're telling too, because you look at
Sure, yeah.
Hemingway, he was very well traveled and all his stories still read very American. But then you
Right.
look at a Faulkner, his stories, they're all set pretty much in the same place. Like he was, I mean, he traveled some, but
Yeah.
even so, he didn't seem like he had a very worldly view in his stories because it was centered around such small
Mm.
towns. And even still, like that's, I mean, I put that as a higher literary merit than Hemingway's work. So
Mm.
it really depends what you're writing.
No, for sure it does. I mean, look, so my dad is Spanish, and my mum, well, my mum basically grew up in the UK. So my mum had French and Australian parents, but she's from London and she sounds like a Londoner. So just for the quiet life, I'm just going to be like, she's from London and my dad is from Spain to make it easy, right? So I had this, half of my life has been in Spain. So when I pick up Hemingway, which of course I don't now, but when I did at school and the rest of it, this kind of like sort of weird, sort of, I don't know, sort of interest in Spain. Like, I tell you what it is. What pissed me off was this tone of the Spaniards will wake up and they'll do this and they'll do that. And it was just like, mate, just relax, right? Like a guy's having a coffee, right? You don't need to like exoticize it as some, like look at the way that they live, and like maybe, but also maybe he's just having a coffee. Maybe it's like not that deep. So I always had like a kind of weird relationship with him in that there was just a natural kind of like, okay, back off, pal, type thing. In the way that I'm sure you guys get that when you read a book that's set in your hometown. To me, at least, I'm like, I hope I like it because it kind of feels like it belongs to me. So if it's bad, I'm going to smash it, Whereas if I like it, I'm really gonna love it. Yeah, man. I think one of the best kind of, at least in the genre I write in, novels written in another country to where the author is from is Gorky Park. I think I'm right in saying that Cruz spent maybe 1 week in Russia. I think it was 7 days, where he went to an archive to check some stuff, and that's it. And when you read that to me felt real. It felt so lived, and it was 1 week. So some people can do it with going on Street View and reading what people say. Other people can live. I don't know. I've read stuff set in London where someone's lived there all their lives, and you think this doesn't feel real to me. So yeah, man, you can either do it or you can't. I think is the crux there.
Well, that's what I appreciate about your books is they didn't seem fetishized. So it wasn't like I've read Japanese books from American writers where it's like, oh, exotic. Well, you use Hemingway's example of Spain. It's like, oh, it's exotic and fancy and cool. And that guy's not drinking coffee. He's having a moment in the Emerald.
Right.
Like, who gives a shit? So you just write Japan as actual Japanese people, not not some weird exotic location which 100%. Is funny because I think our first conversation we ever had years ago, you said one of the reasons that helped you get the publishing deal was the fact that the setting was Japan, so it was exotic to the publisher.
100%.
But you don't write it in an exotic way; you write it in a genuine, authentic way, which is what I think most readers appreciate, whether they know the country or not.
Yeah, and I think, look, that's a really important topic because when we write about a thing, as writers, it's really difficult not to inject yourself into that, right? Because it's from your mind, so you're in there, like it or not. I think when you fetishize a thing, or when you kind of come at it as this is not just a Tuesday, right? You're automatically making it about you, right? Because you're having, oh my God, like I'm in Japan and I'm doing this cool thing and whatever else. Whereas the guy in front of you, to him, it's just a Tuesday morning, right?
Yeah.
I think about that with actors sometimes, where you'll often hear an actor say, well, what's my motivation in this scene? And I think that's kind of what's important to keep in mind with the characters in a book, which is what does this guy want in the scene? And sometimes it's just he wants to get to work and not be late. Right, that's you don't need to set off any explosions. So I think like when we make a mountain out of a molehill, by the way, a dude is drinking his coffee, and we're trying to kind of make it poetic. I'm not saying I'm against poetry because I love I love prose that's poetic and brutal at the same time. But I just think it's like a lot of the time when you read stuff set somewhere where the writer isn't from, there is that habit of being like, oh my God, look at what they do here, and kind of subconsciously what you're saying is, what a cool thing. And I think that kind of shows your hand a bit as the writer, right? Like your job is to get out of the way as the writer. Unless you're Vladimir Nabokov and everything you write is gold, a beautiful sentence sometimes gets in the way, like it's reminding the reader subconsciously, I am God and you are in my universe and I have made it for you. And that kind of breaks the spell a bit for me, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think one of the easiest examples of that is like on your stories, you always publish or you post a lot of the foods you eat, which, just from over here, like I show my wife all the time. It's like, doesn't that fucking look good? And it's like exotic over here because it's just not something you'd normally find in a random cafe.
Right.
And then I always picture as a writer, it's like, well, if I wrote that scene, like how would I write Nicholas eating that? Would I just say, oh, he's eating this croissant with blackberries and weird goo and shit? Or would I be like, oh, have to really go into it and make it this big moment? If you were the American over there and you're writing about someone who's never experienced that, yes, you could do the poetic flourish. But if you're writing something like you said about, I just go to work, like it's not a big deal. Like you're just in the cafe eating, you're not going to fetishize that. You're not going to make it this weird poetic moment. So it really does go into author's intent and who's actually experiencing it in the scene.
Sure. Yeah, like exactly as you say. Is this moment with the croissant? Is this for me, or is it for the reader? And I think I think it's enough to just say that, let's say you're detective. I think it's enough to say he orders a black coffee and a blueberry croissant. I think that's enough. Just by saying that choice, I think you're kind of telling the reader, oh, this is the type of world he lives in. These are the choices he's made, and this is the cafe he's in where you can get a blueberry croissant. Let's say, right? Once you start describing the texture of the filling and the rest of it, you either do that really, really well, or it feels like a hat on a hat. You know what I mean? So I'm not against flowery language, because like flowery language is my jam at the same time. But I just think when you're doing it kind of in a foreign setting to try and kind of like say, look where we are, right? Take this on board. It reminds the reader it's foreign. And I think the trick is to do the opposite and to say he's having breakfast and it's a Tuesday. And yeah, this tells you who he is because of what he orders. Maybe he's got a sweet tooth. But we're not wasting time here on holding up the story to say, get a load of this. You know what I mean?
For a major digression here, this actually brings back when you were on DPW not that long ago about our Murakami, your grievances and some of the grievances we had with his work. That really actually just opened my eyes to why he writes that mundane, making spaghetti and pouring the whiskey, and why do we have to talk about this so much? To the Japanese author, that probably would be kind of exotic, like the spaghetti, because that's not something I would imagine. I mean, it wouldn't be as common because it's a foreign food than, say sushi or something. So if, the guy's making spaghetti, and I'm talking about when he wrote these in, the 80s or whatever. I mean, Japan's like, it's got so much Western influence now that probably wouldn't be out of the ordinary. But at the time, that might actually been seen as an exotic endeavor. It's like, oh, he's making spaghetti and, he's drinking his half glass of beer with it in his home. And isn't that quirky? But that's funny because that's a example of a Japanese writer making his story seem more exotic, even though it's set in Japan and it's Japanese people. And it's like, there's no need for that, really.
Well, it's funny. I can't remember if we spoke about this in that episode, but his nickname over there is Butter, right? Which is like, the kind of unkind nickname of calling him Butter to make it clear, like this guy's Western, right? This is his whole thing. Today a Japanese guy making spaghetti, no one's going to raise an eyebrow, right? It's like not even notable. The kind of impression I always got with him, certainly his earlier stuff, is kind of like, yeah, I'm doing a Western thing. It's no big deal, right? Like it was, I mean, yeah, maybe that's unfair, but it was always kind of like in the way that you would see in Japan or in Spain too, people who wear like English slogans on their shirt, and it means nothing, right? The phrase means nothing, right? But it's in English, so that's cool, right? Like I remember day one in Japan, I was walking out of my hotel and I saw a guy with a little dog and he was wearing a kind of skin tight purple t-shirt, and the phrase on the shirt was, "I ask only that you treat me exactly as you would treat the Queen." Like, not a queen, the Queen, right? I was like, I mean, that's a bad example because that actually does make sense, but yeah, man, he's let's not relitigate Murakami, but yeah, I have my feeling about that.
There's a Italian singer, this is probably 70s or something, I don't remember. But he said that if you did a song in English, Italians would just buy it. So he did a whole pop song in English. It makes no sense at all. Like it's just random English words, and it was like a #1 smash hit for a while.
That song, weirdly, which by the way, it fucking slaps, right? Like
it does.
I can't remember what it was. It's like his surname begins with like CEL something or other. It's cool. It's like some long Italian word, right? But like it's just like 3 minutes of gibberish, right? And his whole thing was trying to sound like Dylan, right? So he's trying to sound like Dylan in his voice, but the words are just bullshit, right? It's like when people speak in tongues or whatever, right? It's just that. And I just love the balls of that, like this doesn't need to make sense. It sounds cool. And yeah, it was like #1. You go check it out now. It slaps, to be fair. So I don't know what that says about pop music.
Well, this whole conversation is actually really nice to me. It's like I can totally see myself doing something ridiculously foolish, like going to Iceland and then romanticizing it in a way that is nice to me but ridiculous for Icelanders,
Right.
and and feeling like a total idiot afterwards.
It's
I
easy to
feel like,
fall into that because I've done that
yeah,
too. Just like, oh, I've been here and I want to. I'm so excited that I
Mm.
actually make myself an asshole without meaning
Right,
to.
right.
especially when like a lot of the stuff that does get published is usually, I mean, this is different, but it's usually from people who are actually from other places,
Mm.
and you get like at least the better magazines that I see, they're publishing stuff that isn't stuff that Americans are very familiar with, because that's more
Mm.
interesting than hearing the same American bullcrap all the time.
Right.
So it makes Americans want to write more stuff like that. So
Mm.
it's like, well, I gotta, if I write stuff like that and I don't know anything about it, I really look like an idiot. But then if I get the experience and I write about it, I might still look like an idiot because I'm writing about it from an American perspective that is just like
But
romantic.
like, I feel like if what you were writing about was within the realms of the experience you had, right, then I don't know, like, you could go to Iceland for a week and you could write a story, let's say, about an American, I don't know, exchange student who's only been there for a few weeks and then has these experiences. That would completely stand up, right? No one would be like, hey, this isn't like credible or authentic or whatever. I mean, look, I think I see this a lot here where Americans, they come over to Spain. Let's say they're 18, 19. They come over to Spain. You can drink legally. It's cheap. The food is good. The weather is nice. People are open. People are warm. And you see these kids, they turn up and they're like, fuck, I'm not going to leave, right? I'm going to stay here, right? And then you meet Fernando, whatever. You get married to him. Healthcare is free. And they're having a nice life, right? So this is not me to be like, look at them turning up here, right? Like, fair play to them. I get it. It would be shitty of me to be like, look at them and they're having their eat, pray, love, year in Europe or whatever. It's a shitty thing to do, to like look at the guy who's from another place and say, what an idiot. He doesn't know what he's doing, right? Because you could leave your hometown and now you're that guy too, right? But I think when you write a book, you're kind of saying, even subconsciously, you're kind of saying, I know what I'm talking about. And that was for sure something that scared me writing Bluelight Yokohama, which was, is someone going to turn around and say, you're not Japanese, you shouldn't tell this story, right? So I think that was kind of part of why, to protect myself, I chose a character who was from Japan, but also not from Japan, and that he would be treated as an outsider, right, throughout the whole story, explicitly to try and kind of avoid that conversation about like, well, who gets to tell this story, man? I mean, I think, look, ultimately, if you write a story about a young Jewish kid in a concentration camp and you're just like, that's just not in your family, that's got nothing to do with you, you're just imagining what it would be like, you can see why people might not appreciate that, right? But we're not talking about, big, heavy subjects. We're talking about a detective novel based on real things. So I think ultimately it's case by case, right? But ultimately nobody controls stories. And as long as you're not trying to suggest that you are writing from a place of experience, if it's not your experience, then I think the whole point of these stories is that they're allowed to be made up and we're allowed to get something true out of them anyway. What's crazy to me is when you do get people who do pretend to be, I don't know, black or Native American or a woman or whatever, and then they just think they won't know, but no one will find out. It's just like, what are you doing, man? Like, there's this woman, I can't remember her Hilaria Baldwin. I don't know if you know who that is. She's married to Baldwin. The guy, is it Alec Baldwin? The guy in the whole. So she's from Boston, right? She's just, she's called Hillary. She's from Boston, but her thing was that when she started to become famous, she was just putting on a Spanish accent. She was like just pretending to be
she
from
wanted
Spain.
A little more flavor.
Yeah, man. It's like she's you can see it on, for anybody who hasn't, I recommend looking up Hilaria Baldwin Cucumber. There's a moment where she's like on a cooking program and she's like, and then you are slicing the how you say cucumber. It's like, you're from Massachusetts, you know how to say cucumber. It's wild, but good luck to her.
It's like Madonna randomly becoming British over the years.
Oh God, I was in London for that, and it was It was like,
Stupid, horrible.
you know, where you just see a thing and you're like, I'm embarrassed for you. I have to change the channel for you because this is, yeah, that was bad, man.
Oof.
Well, what you touched on was exactly the part of like the travel writing that appeals to people is as long as it's your authentic experience, it doesn't matter if even if it comes off stereotypical. It's like, oh yeah, I went to Japan and I went to
Right.
one of the sushi places with the conveyor belts and I went to the robot bar and the cat cafe. And it's like, so you did all the stereotypical things, but since it's still your experience, that's authentic.
Sure.
It's not going to come off as offensive. But then if you're just writing about some random Japanese person and they're doing all that same stupid shit. It's
Right.
like, well, no, they're not tourists. They're probably not doing
Right.
that. So then, yeah,
Right.
it's nuanced, but I can see that. Also, I did remember, I don't know if it was Sins of Scarlet. It might have been Bluelight Yokohama. I read one of the reviews. It was I don't even think it was a fully negative review, maybe like a 3-star review or something. But the one, like, it opened up with, another British guy writing about Japan or something along like you can't do that apparently. And then that just
Right.
makes you immediately not want to take the review seriously because like,
Right.
I mean, just because you aren't from that country, you can't write about it. Like
Right.
that's one of those things that's weird because some people do view that. It's like if you're a white person, you can't write a black story. If
Right.
you're, I mean, you use the concentration camp example. I think it would be in bad taste to write a story set in a concentration camp dealing with Jewish people if you have no experience, no one in your family, you don't know anything. But at the same time, you can still write about the events,
Right.
and
Right.
you
Well,
can
and people
interview
do
people,
write
you can
about
do all
World War
kinds of
II all the
stuff.
time, right? Like it's people. I mean, look, if we have to be the thing that we're writing, then in the end, everything just becomes biography, right?
Mhm.
And I think that's kind of we already have that. I think there's a difference between trying to pass something off as you versus telling a story. Like it or not, there are topics where if you go there, it's not that you're not allowed to, but people are not going to like it. And I think there's this kind of really kind of infantile complaint about, oh, these days you can't say this stuff. And it's like, mate, you can say it, right? But if you say a shitty thing that people don't like, they're probably going to let you know. And I think the key here is like, are you passing it off as you? Are you talking about something where, like, if we begin the topic of, let's say, Israel and Palestine right now, how many people in the comments are going to be like, a measured debate, no notes, right? It's just, there are certain subjects where, by their nature, if you get into it, right, it's a can of worms. That's politics. You can't do anything about it. If you're writing a detective novel set in Portugal and you're from Idaho, but you spent 6 months in Portugal or whatever, who gives a shit, man? And I just think, like you say, why is it that we're applying these expectations of author based on, well, he's from this landmass, so therefore he will or won't know, right? Because if we turn that around and say, oh, well, he's in his 40s, so how can he write a story about a woman who's 60? It's like, how far do you go with those kind of expectations of author? To
Well,
me,
that's
man, it's
exactly
like,
it. How far do you go? I mean, John Steinbeck's writing about, poor dirt dust bowl farmers. Can he
right,
not write about that because he didn't experience that? Can
you're
Harper
right,
Lee not write about segregation and civil rights just because she was a white lady? I mean, she did it from a white people's perspective, but could she not write the black characters? Like, how
right.
far do you go with that?
Well,
You lose
Shakespeare
out on
wasn't
a lot of
Italian,
very important
and he
work if
wrote
you did
Romeo and
that.
Juliet, right? And he
Yeah.
wasn't an Italian teenage girl, right? So, just like how far do you go with the thing? Look, the answer to that is it's if a thing is good, right, it's good, right? If a thing feels real, it feels real. And the way I think to not only kind of settle this is judge it in the characters. It's not so much the setting, right? It's, do the characters feel real? Do I go with this? Do I believe them? You have to try and put your faith in the author, and you either feel like they're in control or not, and you'll know that quite quickly within the first sort of, however many pages. I just think that when a book works for you, when the place feels real, it's usually because the characters who are taking you by the hand into that world, because they feel real too. And so, to go back to the location, you could go to Iceland for a week, and I think if you did write a story in Iceland, the quality of it would probably depend on how many Icelandic people you spoke to, right? How much you watched them. And I think the more you did that, the better the story would feel versus, like you say, just kind of standing there and going, oh, well, there's the cathedral and there's the Blue Lagoon. And you know what I mean? So it always comes down to characters, which is, I think, the basic kind of DNA of what makes people love a book or a game or a story or not. You know what I mean? It's ultimately always the character.
Yeah. I am going to keep that in mind, and in the way that I in the way that I plan the rest of my trip too. I've been
I'm
trying
looking
to
forward to your Icelandic story.
okay. Yeah, I've been trying to like plan all this stuff, and now that we're talking, I'm like, I think I'm planning too many like sightseeing things and not
Mm,
enough just sitting in public
Experience.
and observing. Yeah.
yeah. Well, look,
So
I mean, Icelandic. I mean, look, Iceland is like there is a lot to see, and those
yeah.
sites are fucking amazing, and definitely see them. But yeah, man, like take a day or two to hang out in the city, hang out in Reykjavik, talk to people. They're so
Yep.
nice there as well. Like it's almost like growing up in a big city. I'm like, wait a minute, what's the deal here? It's like they're too nice, you know. But yeah, great place, man. Thingvilla National Park. You got to go to that national park, especially if it's like icy. There's a big waterfall. That was the first ever parliament in human history, and they were like a bunch of people get together and decide, okay, so what should we do about this issue? You know, that's like the birthplace of democracy, so far as we know.
Oh.
Even if the decisions could be, do we throw her over the waterfall or do we not? You know, but they were voting. You know,
Yeah, I think that is in my itinerary, so I'm
nice.
covered there. Yeah, I'm there for like almost 2 weeks, so I have a decent amount of time
Oh,
to
sweet.
sort myself out there. Yeah, but from here, we have kind of a unique opportunity here because most of our guests that we interview, we're meeting them for the first time, or
Mm.
nobody knows anything about them. Since you've been on DPW 3 times, people have, and Caleb's here with us. We can say we've got a good bit of background on you, and we can go forward with video game talk. So if people want to hear more about your writing, you can check out. I actually did the research, believe it or not, about which
Oh man.
episodes that you were on DPW. So,
Cambridge
Even I
uh,
don't remember that.
well, interestingly enough, I googled it just to see if like the if like the Nicolas Obregon name would pop up with DPW, and Bing, the AI, uh, aggregated it for me. It
Oh,
was really
nice.
creepy. So, yeah, the Drunken Pen Writing episodes number 55, number 116, and the Murakami Minute episode that aired on February 20th, 2024.
Did
Unless there's
you
more than
happen to
that.
see if he was our actual first guest on there? Because I don't remember. I think he was, but I'm not
I
sure.
didn't check, but it seemed like it was probably because it was something the title of it was something like writing talk or something like that. So it
Yeah,
seemed like
I
very
think Nick was
first
our first
guesty.
guest in that shitty old kitchen of mine.
So yeah, if anyone wants to hear more writing background about Nicholas Obregon's books, you can check those out. But now we can just spend the rest of the time talking about video games and how that also influenced your writing. So tell us, what was it like for you growing up with video games, and how did you experience them?
Um, to me, so yeah, so like I said, I was back and forth between London and Madrid, right? These two different worlds, and I was kind of a quiet kid. You know, I was like a little fat kid, and didn't, you know, really have much other than books and video games, right? So that to me really felt like um, because I was between these two places, the world felt so kind of overwhelmingly big. Um, it was a refuge. So I'd turn on the Sega Genesis, as you called it. We had the Mega Drive in the rest of the world. I would
Mhm.
turn that on, and the little blue logo would flash up, and that was like a little wormhole. It's like a little galaxy in which you felt like you were in charge, right? Or it felt like you could kind of have a little bit of power within that world. You could go places, you could be things. So to me, my first experiences were through Sega, through those kind of like, you know, early 90s games, a couple from 89. But yeah, and so that to me, it was that console. I mean, I had a Game Boy as well, but that for whatever reason didn't like kind of move me. When I think about the kind of birth of my love of stories, it's somewhere between a bunch of like sword and sorcery, choose your own adventure books, and then the Sega Mega Drive, and the kind of and some anime thrown in there as well. So that was kind of the birth of the love of story for me. Was that little blue bling with Sega coming up? I was like, now we're talking, man.
Were there particular games that you got really hooked on the stories in them?
Yeah, man. I think, I mean, not to give like a big long kind of laundry list, but I would say, just to talk about kind of one or two. I mean, I remember particularly Streets of Rage. I don't know if in America it was called Bare Knuckle, or maybe that was only in Japan. But Streets of Rage, where basically you open on the kind of a sweep across a city, and there's some text about how the city is really corrupt, and the police is corrupt, everything is corrupt, and crime reigns supreme, and all of this, and only one person or three people can stop it, and these are the characters that you basically batter the shit out of an entire city. You just side scroll your way through, just destroy everything. That, to me, man, it was like the beginning of Streets of Rage, which, for anyone who doesn't know that game, the fucking soundtrack on that game, by the way, right?
Awesome.
Where like it's just like supreme, man. Like I know that they still in Tokyo, they have like techno orchestras that come together, and that they still have reproductions of, I forget his name, but it begins with a Y, of his soundtrack of that game.
Wow.
That game for me, it was like, it kind of felt like the manga I was reading, particularly Akira. It felt the closest thing. I mean, there were some Japanese games too, but it felt like the closest thing to, I'm in Akira. I'm in this kind of dystopian, nihilistic world, and I'm going to kind of, make it right one punk at a time. That to me really was like that kind of urban decay. It just got a hold of me, man. It got under my skin, and I was like, whatever this is, I want to do this for a living. I want to be involved in this in some capacity. I was, 5, I didn't 6. It's probably an inappropriate, game for a kid that age. But back then, man, a lot of parents didn't give a shit. They were like, oh, it's a video game, no big deal. And you're there just hitting someone with a crowbar. It's great, man. Yeah. So I would say, to pick one, it would probably be Streets of Rage. That's kind of my early experience of like, not just liking a game, but being like, fucking like, this is the best thing in my life, is this fucking game.
That's awesome. Have you ever thought about how a lot of old games like that, they have that kind of opening that gives you like a background of what's going on, and then there is absolutely no other storytelling the rest of the game, but your memory of it feels like this complete story arc, like, because I don't know if it's like a kid thing, but
you just create it.
Yeah. And that's something that I feel like is hard to kind of explain in our episodes, but I feel like even when a game has next to no story, it's still extremely significant to me. And it might just be a nostalgia thing, but like kind of a good example is when we did our Castlevania episode. There's nothing there, but it's also enormous. It's so big and still significant to me. And yeah, I don't know if it's like a childhood thing where your mind is more like able to fill in those gaps because you have nothing else going on in your life but playing that game and getting to the end of the story.
Well, also I think it's exactly that, man. It's like, I've always kind of disagreed with this idea where like video games are just kind of like biodegradable, throwaway little stories, and really it's just about mashing buttons, right? Yeah. It's not like that isn't fun, and it's not like there isn't like a level of like mastery or skill to it, because of course it's a big component. But the story unfolds as you get better, right? You get new levels, new characters, new bad guys, different endings, right? Depending on how good you are. You are rewarded with more story the further you go. And I think there's something really beautiful about like kind of telling a kid, like, here's this game. And you start playing. And some games are fucking brutal. Like, you go back now and you think, well, I was 5. I'll probably be really good now. I'll probably like finish it. And then you go back and you're like, what the fuck? Like, how is any 5-year-old kid gonna, but something like Castlevania or something like Streets of Rage, not until the very end do you kind of get more of an update on the story, which is, Mr. X is gone and blah, blah, blah. I think it's called Mr. X. So it's not like they spent a lot of time worrying about like, character names and the rest of it. But I think there is something really beautiful about being rewarded with story as you play, because I don't think there's a huge difference, huge binary between stories and video games, because ultimately, like, what we're talking about is we're talking about story. We're talking about imagination. Imagination is just another form of play, right? Like we know that this didn't really happen. We're playing along with it, and a video game is like a physical manifestation of what these guys are doing, right?
Yes. Yeah. So on that token, where do you feel like, I mean, I want to know more, like, if you played more than just Genesis in that era, and also like where it started translating for you, or where you started thinking about them in terms of applying it to your writing.
So I would say, I mean, the kind of the way in which I experienced other types of games or other consoles or platforms would be like at that age, 5 through to like 10, 11. You go to your buddy's house and he's got some other console, right? And when you're that age, you're like, when you go to a friend's house when you're a kid and their house smells different, it's got like that other person smell, and they've got the food that they eat and the stuff that they do. So you go and you kind of, now your buddy makes more sense to you. You're like, oh, I get why, you do this and you say that. And when they would fire up, they're like, in most cases, it'd be the Super Nintendo. It'd be like the different one, right? Or there was one guy I knew who had a Neo Geo. Oh. And I was like, what the fuck, man? Like, I think that was something, it was like $1,000 or something back then. It's just like, who has one of those? So it would only be fleeting experiences with other platforms, with other consoles, up until I get to like PlayStation 1. And then PlayStation 1, I remember it was Wipeout. And I don't know what year that is, 95, 96 or something like that, 97 maybe. Wipeout just felt like the speed of it and the graphics and the sound. Obviously, it's set in the future, but that to me was like, oh, like nothing will ever look this good again. Not, this has gone to a place that nobody else could ever go to. That was kind of the moment I knew that like Sega was like dead to me, and this was going to be, it was kind of sad because you're letting go of that good stuff, but it was like this is the way forward. To answer the other part of the question about how it influenced my writing, yeah, man, I think it's just those were it's very difficult to pass out the books I was reading from the games I was playing, because those were really the only two things that I was doing in my brain, were those two things, those two forms of story. I remember very, very vividly, I think I was about 8 or 9, and by this point I'd moved with my mother to London. So my parents had split up definitively, and we were moving to London. Me and my mum were going to London, and this was going to be my new life. And I wasn't happy about that. I was a quiet kid anyway, but now I'm quiet and I'm a bit uncertain about my language ability. I could speak it, but there was an accent going on, and I felt like I'm a foreign kid. And I remember the teacher said, we're going to do like a book club. So everybody has to bring in a book, and then you have to read out a bit, and then we're going to lend and borrow books and all of this shit. And that put the fear of God into me, because it was public reading, public speaking, but also in fucking English. And like, I thought so many ways, how can I get out of this? And in the end, my mum was like, look, you're just going to have to do it. Once it's done, you'll feel happy you did it. So I came in with a book called Dinotopia. It's a story by James Gurney where it's like, it's on this magical island where dinosaurs and humans live together. And the beginning is the dad and his son are shipwrecked on this island. And I read out page 1 where they wake up on this tropical island and they hear this big crashing sound. And then through the foliage, this huge dinosaur comes out and kind of towers above them. And that's the end of the first page. And I turned the book around, and it was this big, like, sort of watercolor spread of the dinosaur. And I remember in the faces of my classmates, they were absolutely just sort of like transfixed. And I remember in that moment thinking, that is power, right? This guy who's written this book has the power, right, to capture people. And I recognized the second feeling was, this is how it feels like when I'm playing video games. This is the same thing. I'm seeing in their faces what I feel like I'm in front of the screen. So yeah, man, I think it's like, even in my first book, I kind of make a reference to Streets of Rage, to Bare Knuckle. Like, it's there because these early kind of cuts are the deepest, man. These early kind of tastes of culture, they form the way in which you think about culture later on, man. So yeah, for me, those are like the first moments where I knew, experiencing those stories, I knew I want to also tell those stories for other people to experience, man. That's the good
Right.
stuff.
And I want to, because you said the word culture, I have a follow up question that goes right with that.
Mhm.
So each of us has our own history with gaming,
Mhm.
but since we find that they were impactful for us in a lot of ways, and sometimes continue to be impactful if we're still playing them, do you think video games should be considered a must, as something that cultures us as individuals in the world, just like we think of books and movies and
Mhm.
storytelling in general? Do you think it's something that that should be encouraged instead of seen as a waste of time?
I think the idea that somehow they're inherently not culture, or they're inherently a lower form of it. I kind of I understand where that comes from, but also if we go into like the 1930s, people would look down their nose at cinema as a kind of brash, kind of
Right.
low culture as well, right? This is the same school of thought where, like, in the early 2000s, like, don't do online dating, that's weird, and now it's completely acceptable to be on Tinder or whatever the fuck people use. um, I think not only should it be considered for what it is, it's either good story or it's bad story, like anything else.
Hmm. Yeah.
I think it's just inevitable that it will get there. I mean, we spoke off air about The Last of Us, and I think that, I don't know if that's the point of critical mass, but certainly that's a kind of a point in time where I can kind of indicate and say that's a moment where I remember playing that video game, and now, the lady at the bus stop is talking about The Last of Us, albeit on HBO, but it is a video game that is informing culture at large. And now we're all talking about Pedro Pascal and the rest of it. Fine, but that came out of PlayStation. So
Right.
I think, yeah, okay, most games are not The Last of Us for their level of their scope of story, but it is shown that, it's out there. Look, for every The Last of Us, there'll be like an Assassin's Creed movie, right? So there's good and there's bad, like anything else. But I think it's inevitable, man. The more when you make The Last of Us, you set the bar there, and now people realize, like, oh, I can't just churn out some dog shit, right? Like, because who am I competing with? I'm competing with that. You know what I mean? And I think I said to you off air, like, I remember my secondary school literature teacher, or one of them, saying video games are a waste of time because you'll never have a video game that tells a story as well as a novelist can. And I remember playing The Last of Us for the first time and thinking, "Fuck you! That's the right here. This story is better than a lot of books that I have read, and I will read."
Right. Yeah. Um. Yeah, and for all we know, there are already starting to be. I mean, I would say it's likely that there are already uh, classes forming in college based around the video game story.
100%.
Because I mean, I before we even started talking about The Last of Us, I was gonna say, like, have you seen how like the stories that are in some? I mean, not all of them are winners, but
Mm,
that are in some of these modern games. It's like,
yeah.
holy hell! And like our last guest was my advisor from college, in the writing program. Um, and he was saying how they are literally hiring legit writers for these.
Yeah.
And even if you're not a big gamer, like, you can, it's unavoidable. Like, it's fact. Like,
Mm.
they are at least starting to be seen as a credible form of storytelling and culture. I mean, and especially if you look at something which is something you can probably relate to. I don't know. Do you know about Ghost of Tsushima?
Oh yeah, yeah, totally.
Yeah,
Like
I haven't played it,
they
but
have a director's mode in that game.
yeah,
Right? Like,
right.
you know what I mean?
Yeah, so stuff like that, like I don't know. Again, I don't know anything about it, but I know it's like very Japanese and legitimate, and you can actually play it where there are I think no English subtitles, like just in Japanese, which is really cool and not something that you
Yeah.
see in America in
No,
American games.
and I think, I mean, look, that's a good example because not only is this of it, look, yeah, it's samurai and that's cool, right? Like you know, the parts of that game where it's like two samurai having a duel by the ocean and they're like these waves crashing over rocks and they're just staring at each other for that indeterminate amount of time. You watch that and you're like, this is fucking cool, right? Like I'm a kid again
Yeah.
watching. But also these are events which are at least in large part informed by historical events, right? Like these are, you know, the Mongolians did, you know, have these assaults and so on and so forth. They, you know, I think it's 1 in 200 men today is descended from Genghis Khan, right?
Mm.
So either he falls in love a lot, or there was a lot of conquest going on and everything that went with it. So how interesting that video game, but informed by history, real events. That now is just like, yeah, okay, it's still a video game and there are mechanisms and it's fun to play and the rest of it, but not even just like books, like actual like history. So there's story within history, and now it's a video game as well. Would it shock me if in a couple of years' time there's like a Ghost of Tsushima HBO series? No. Would it shock me if by 2035 like there's an Academy Award for the best video game? No, it wouldn't shock me. You know, I think it's getting there, whether people want to accept it or not, because it's just a different way of not only consuming story, but how much do we spend to let's say to go to the movie theater? Let's say we spend 20 or 30 bucks. A video game is going to set you back anywhere between like 60 or 100 bucks. And if you can make that game for the same amount of money in less time than a movie takes, for Hollywood, yeah, the love of cinema and the rest of it, but it's numbers, it's money at the end of the day. If kids are buying them, if adults are buying them, they're not going to give a shit what package it's in, whether it's a video game or a cinema movie or Netflix. It's if it sells, man. And I think what something like Ghost of Tsushima proves, or The Last of Us, is that the quality in these things don't have to take a hit just by nature of their medium. Not only can they be as good, but in some cases, a lot of fucking cases, they can be better. You know, you see that movie, I don't know if you saw The Grey Man. That was a Netflix movie. It was like the most expensive Netflix movie of all time.
I don't think I
Directed
saw
by
it.
the Russo brothers, who made the most bankable film of all time, with actors people like, and all done by committee, and it's going to be a hit, and you watch it and you feel nothing. You feel nothing. You know, all the money in the world, you feel nothing. You play something like The Last of Us, and I defy anyone to play that game and feel nothing. You know, so
Yeah.
I don't think the medium has to dictate the quality of the story at the end of the day. That's my argument.
When it comes down to it, anything that fosters the growth of imagination and pushes the exploration of creativity is going to shape the culture. And inherently,
100%.
that's going to bring in the money. And then that's going to create a tidal wave of people who want to replicate that success. And then that's when you get video games that start off as Streets of Rage, beat 'em up, barely any story. And then you get the Ghost of Tsushima and everything else that comes with that. So I agree with you. I think pretty soon you're going to be seeing major awards such as Academy Awards for best video game adaptation and things
Right.
like that. And it's just going to create probably a whole new medium of storytelling that didn't exist before, because before the only visual mediums for storytelling were comic books
Right.
and movies.
Right.
And movies have gone stagnant. Comics have pretty much fallen off. So that leaves the newest one, which started in the 80s, video games. And even video game stories really didn't advance until probably the late 80s. Well, if you're going PC, I guess. I'm always thinking of consoles. But yeah, PC games are a little earlier. So early 80s, maybe even late 70s. But a lot of that actually stems from, and I don't know if you ever played these, but what was really popular in Japan for a long time were graphic novels, or I don't think that was the name for them. But they
like
were like,
playable ones, right?
yeah, they were like video game novels. So it was almost like an anime or a manga. So you'd have some cutscenes and stuff, but it was just mainly like, you're reading a story. So I think there's going to be some kind of hybrid of that coming in the future where you get a lot more, which you already see on Steam, a lot of video games that are more experimental. And I'm just really excited to see where that goes. And hopefully that leads to a rebirth of writers coming out and actually being creative and not just rehashing the same fucking shit that we see over and over again.
100%, man. Like for me, like I had a kind of flirtation with a director about adapting one of my books into a movie or a series, and we kind of got kind of far along with it. And then for various reasons, it didn't work out, COVID and stuff like that. But that obviously there was a moment in time where I was like, oh, it's going to happen and this is going to be so cool. But the flip side to that is, what if it's bad, right? Like, what if you still get paid and people will still go, oh, well, the book was better than the movie or whatever. So it's not the end of the world. But like that idea of like, what if it's bad is there anytime there's an adaptation. Like if I said to you, Bryce, they're going to make a Castlevania movie, let's say, right? And I don't know, Michael Fassbender is going to be in the lead role, right? What would be like your first reaction there? Would you be like, cool? Or would you be like, I don't know?
Oh yeah, definitely. I don't know.
Because like you're gonna the fear is you're gonna ruin it, right? Like
yeah.
Whereas if I said to you, let's say like one of your books, Caleb, is going to be turned into a video game, would you not just be like, fuck yeah? Like even if it's bad, you'd be like, fuck yeah. You go like, so I think maybe we're not a million miles away of reaching a point where there is that real elasticity between the media itself and what's to stop a cool book idea becoming a video game and then becoming a movie or whatever else. The only worry I have about that, and this was actually a worry I had when I heard that The Last of Us was going to be a series, was, do we need this? Like, do we need it 5 different ways? You know, I was worried. I was like, because if it's just shot for shot, then why do we even need to go there, right? But then they kind of did like a weird. Have you guys seen the series?
I haven't.
No, because I haven't played the game, so I wanted to wait until I played it first.
Yeah, well, I won't ruin anything for you, but I would say that the series kind of does this hybrid thing of some stuff is shot for shot from the game, and some other stuff kind of goes in a different direction. And I really liked the fact that they did that, where for me, they kind of walked the line between really not just respecting the source, but also really loving the source, but at the same time, not just wasting your time by saying, it's the video game, but now it's Pedro Pascal, right?
Yeah.
But they did a few kind of new things, which also took it in different directions. I don't know, man. I think that ultimately the way in which you consume the food, right, whether it's a spoon or a fork or whatever, it tastes good or it tastes bad. That's the bottom line, right?
Well, there's a few camps with that line of thinking. So you have the Alan Moores. He believes that no, I wrote this as a book or a graphic novel. That's what the medium is. It's not adaptable. Like that's how you're supposed to take this. And when they make movies off it, he gets super pissed off. I thought Watchmen was great and it was a good adaptation of the graphic novel. He hated it. He hates everything. But then you also think of like a Frank Miller Sin City. I read the books and they were cool. The fucking movie was like revolutionary to me, just the way they filmed it at the time. And I thought it was really cool. And I would say probably better. You know, you think of like The Princess Bride. That's probably way better than the book. I read the book. It was fun. Movie's a classic. So adaptations can definitely be hit or miss. But I think when it comes down to it, it's just about like you said, the passion and respect the source material. If you have a love for the story, it's probably going to show through in the final product. Again, as long as producers and fucking shitheads like that don't get involved. Like, okay, think of like a Max Payne series. Could you imagine an Inspector Iwata video game series? That'd be fucking awesome. And at some point, it would deviate from the source material. It'd be really hard to have just a book version of the video game, but that could be an awesome series.
Yeah, man. Look, I think the big difference between the mediums is not so much the way that we consume them, because of course it's different to have like a joystick in your hand whilst you're watching a screen versus you're in a book and you're plugged in. I think it's more the way in which the story is created. The main difference with, let's say, a movie or a TV series, or even a fucking podcast, the amount of people that need to say yes, the amount of people that need to be involved is a lot higher versus a book where, okay, you probably need an agent and you need an editor to buy your book. And sure, there might be negotiations and the rest of it. But ultimately, you're talking about a very, very short list of people who have to say yes to your book for it to see the light of day. And for you to reach that point of them saying yes, you just put your ass in the chair and you just puke it out. You just bullshit it out, right? The list of people in order to create this world that in 3 or 4 years' time or whatever it is, readers from all over the world will come to this world you've made and will live in it. That list is really short versus a movie where even if it's a small indie film, people have to be involved. And if people are involved, like you said earlier on, there are opinions, there's a give and take, stuff goes out, stuff goes in. So the nature of creation itself, I think the big purity with books is it's the closest thing you can get to what the creator intends versus, I don't know, man. Like I was talking today about Dirty Dancing 2. I didn't know this, but it turns out that some guy writes a screenplay about his like mother who was in Havana at the time of the revolution. And it was this like real kind of like weighty kind of biopic, right? About these historical events swirling around his mum. And the studio buys that fucking screenplay, says, great. And there's going to be dancing, and now it's Dirty Dancing 2 set in Havana. And the guy's like, okay, well, I have this money in my bank account, which I'm not going to say no to, but that was not what I intended, right? If that was a book, then what he wrote is very likely going to be super close to what ends up on the shelf. And I think that's the beauty with the intention of writing. Once it becomes a movie and the rest of it, it gets mutates into different shapes and the rest of it. I don't know much about the way that video games are made. For example, I know that in The Last of Us, you got 2 or 3 or 4 people who have a major input on what that story is, and then a bunch of people working to make it happen. I don't, but I could be wrong about that. But I think it's sort of somewhere closer to, I'm talking about like Naughty Dog, and I'm talking about The Last of Us specifically. But I think generally too, right? It's not like 40 guys in a room saying, what if we have spiders? And what if we, you know what I mean? I think there's like less of that going on. I could be bullshitting there. So
Yeah, and that's something that I've been wanting to talk more about in our regular episodes. It's really, I feel like it's hard enough though when we're trying to pull together all the details from the games and the books themselves for these episodes. And we already have like an hour and a half long show, so it gets really complicated. But that is something that I really want to eventually talk more about, is the people that make them and the decisions that are made that come together to create the game that we know.
right.
And because that is part of the game story. It's not just the game you're playing. Which we I've been preaching this since we interviewed our first guest, David Craddock. But yeah, that fascinates me because I hadn't really thought about that at the initial creating of this show, but that's people made these things, and there's more to just what you're experiencing with your controller in your hand and when you're watching the TV than there's people behind it, and I want to know more about that, and I want other people to know more about that and feel and experience video games in more of a way that you experience books, where the guy that wrote it. It's on the cover.
Right.
I never really thought about the purity of art as a subject like that. So, I mean, you think of, sculptors and painters, that's probably about as pure as you'll get. Like it's just the artist. That's it. I mean, you could sell it, you could do whatever, it could be reproduced, but when it comes down to it, it's just that artist and that's their work. Writer, unless you're self-publishing, it's your work, but then you have an editor, you have a publisher, you have some multiple inputs that form the final work. Then video games, you have a whole studio, and like Nick was saying, yeah, you probably have 4 or 5 guys or people that are involved in the actual creative aspect of it, but you still need writers for it. You still need the artists who are going, hey, like much like comic books, where it's like, hey, this is a collaborative effort. Even though you want to tell this story in this way, it's not doable, or we have to do it this way to make it more informed. Or, which is always an interesting one, we can tell the story through the art, so you don't need the
Right.
dialogue and the writing necessarily in the way people would normally think of, because being an interactive medium, it could almost be like, let's have the player tell the story through their
Right.
action. That's one that always boggles my mind, is like how to tell a story through actions, through the, your input. It's almost like a choose your own adventure. That's
Right.
fucking awesome.
Well, it's so funny because, like I mentioned up top, that was those were early experiences for me. Were those books? There's a series by a guy called Steve Jackson, and they're called Sorcery, but sorcery with an exclamation mark, right? Like sorcery. And those books, man, which are set in this world of magicians and trolls and witches and all that shit, they were so brutal. Like you would sort of you'd build up like a playthrough. And then it would be like, do you choose to give the hag some bread or not? And if you say, yeah, you go to page whatever, right? And so like so many times you'd make a choice, right? And it would be like, give the hag some bread, let's say, right? So you give the old lady the bread, you go to the page, and it would be like, you're dead, fuck you, go back to the beginning. Like, what? And it really felt like, one of those kind of like early video games where like the difficulty level was just like, who has these reflexes? Like, this is meant to be for a kid. No one. And what I like to think about, like you say about the purity of the creative process. I don't know if you guys have ever played a game called Alien Isolation.
Yes.
So look, people. It's so good that people talk about it sometimes as like within the Alien movie canon, right? Like it's so good. They're like it should be included, right? So essentially, it's like Ellen Ripley's daughter, and you're on this big space station which is abandoned, and it's got this real like chunky retro future kind of technology in the way that the first Alien movie has, and you're just being hunted by the alien as you try and get from A to B. And it's really creepy because there are these like early androids that some of them come after you, but like in a really creepy way where they'll come after you and they'll be like, you are being hysterical. And then they try and like get you. You're just constantly shitting yourself playing this game. But I read an interview about it, and the developers were talking about the nature of terror, the nature of being afraid. So we had to create an AI from the alien where it would come for you and it would hunt for you and it would get you, but it couldn't get you that much because then it would start to feel unfair. And if it starts to feel too unfair, then it's not fun to play anymore. So it starts to talk about these AI patterns of hunting. And if you did this, then a pattern would swirl out this way. But if you did that, it would swirl out this way. And your likelihood of being caught would be higher and lower. But you imagine these guys in a room talking about what is terror? What is the nature of terror? And you think like you're a computer game developer. And here you are talking about philosophical themes of what it is to be afraid for your life and the rest of it, man. That to me that's no different than conversations I've had with my editor or my agent about the story I'm trying to tell, what it is I'm trying to achieve, the questions that then get asked, That is storytelling even before you've even written a single line of code or written a sentence in your book or whatever it might be.
Well, that's a whole genre of video games now, the philosophical games. And I haven't played too many of those just for the fact that then I'm going to go down the wormhole,
Right.
Like once you do that, it's like, okay, now I'm just going to be some fuckhead in the woods that nobody's going to talk to for a couple years because he's playing these weird philosophical video games. And then when he finally comes back, he has a beret and a extra long goatee. It's like, okay. But I really do like that. Like, it would honestly probably make for a cool episode if we could figure a way to do it, but just the life lessons you learn from video games.
Yeah.
I mean, even a simple one you brought up earlier was just, I'm not playing Sega anymore because the next, I got a PlayStation now. And it's like the change, the letting go of the past to move to the future.
Right.
Like that's just a simple one. There's so many that actually come from the video games themselves. And I would like to explore that sometime in the future.
I mean, yeah, like that sounds like a great episode off the bat right there. But I mean, I remember the first time I played Resident Evil, and I was staying at my grandparents' house. I don't know how old I am, like 13, 12 or something like that, whatever age that is. And I'm staying in this big house, and I'm downstairs in the dark. They're asleep. And I've got the PlayStation on, and I'm playing Resident Evil. And I remember getting quite early into the game and reaching a point and thinking, well, this is too scary, man. This is too much, right?
Mhm.
Because there would be parts of that game where there would be no music. It would just be silent and just your footsteps going around, man. I can't quite convey when you're a child, like the idea of like playing a game that feels like it's not meant for you, it's meant for like adults. The kind of disconnect between how exciting that is, but also how like kind of like wrong it feels at the same time. And I remember there was like you say, there's a specific moment, like, and it's basically philosophical, where I'm there at 12 and I'm asking myself, are you a coward or are you not a coward? Can you accept the fear and play through anywhere? And I reached the point where I'm like, fuck it. Even though it's 11 o'clock at night, I'm going to play, right? So I turn it on, I play. And then about like 60 seconds later, there's the bit where the dogs come through the window, right?
Fucking terrifying.
And I don't know, man. It's stuff like that where I was like, no, I've definitely bitten off more than I can chew, man. This is too.
That's like trying to level up in real life and going to fight a boss that you're not ready for. Like I remember when I was probably 5 or 6, I watched A Nightmare with Elm Street with my family and should not have watched that
No.
movie. And I remember that haunting me for years after that, just that because it was fucking scary. It still holds up too, but it's just like, oh, I went and fought a boss I was not at all ready for,
Yeah.
like way ahead of where I was supposed to be. And Resident Evil, yeah, that was one of those games. It's like if you played that as a kid, you shouldn't have been playing that as a
No,
kid.
you really shouldn't. I remember seeing Aliens like way too young, like way fucking too young, man. And it is that like real weird space of like I hate it, but like also I love it, and I'm just like thinking about it all the time. And like I've got like a real core memory of towards the end of that film where Ripley goes back into the hive to try and get Newt. And she's there just like by herself, man, with the drones coming at her. And she's there with the fucking pulse rifles going, "Drrr, drrr, drrr," and like her face is lighting up. And I just remember in that moment thinking, no one has ever been fucking more cool than this woman right here, like just by herself. And I think in that moment, like the fact that she was really scared, you can see how like she's shaking, right? And she's sweating and the rest of it, but she's doing it anyway. You know, it's these moments of story where you kind of go, oh, like you're more heroic, right? Because you're afraid, but you're doing it anyway. And I was like, I don't know, like maybe 8, 9, 10, watching that film like way too early. But it's weird how like you get these core memories and like on the one hand you're terrified, but like you say, within that, there is also like a kind of life lesson to it, man. It's just the beauty of like, you know.
Well, as a society, we're kind of blessed in the regard that we get to experience those kind of things in a harmless medium. Because if you look at the past, you know, the Great War, World War II, you had teenagers basically going to fight and experience the most horrific atrocities known to man at the time. And that was their life lessons. That was their how do you overcome? How do you develop courage? We don't have to, we do that virtually now. We can learn those lessons without actual danger. So that is something that you could take away from video games and movies and books that you couldn't in the past. Because in the past, you were just doing it for real. And it's like, fuck that.
Yeah.
Yep.
And I mean that's the thing, man. Like when people have like other fish to fry, like when they're, I can give you an example. When I was living in Los Angeles, I spent some time doing mentoring in youth incarceration, and I thought it would be like Dead Poets Society, right? I thought like I'd go in there and I'd talk about John Keats and I'd talk about poems, and these kids would be like, "Yeah, this is really cool. This is what I'm going to do with my life." And then I got in there, man, and you see these kids, and you're like, oh, like, so this 14-year-old boy, his main preoccupation today is not being raped and not being stabbed. And I'm in there being like, John Keats, and he's like, cool, I got other fish to fry, man. You know, like,
Yeah.
and it's that thing of like, initially kind of feeling like it felt like I was the kid. Like it felt like I was coming in with these big ideals, right? And I didn't know what I was talking about. And then after a while, you realize this matters all the more because you're in this fucking hellhole, right? Because if you crack that book open, those poems, even though the guy is in a different scenario to you, he's talking about feelings that you will have. He's talking about stuff that will apply to you. And the fact you're here, trapped, this is a key. This is a window out of this world, man. You know, and who's to say you don't stick at it? And when you come out later on down the line, there's nothing stopping you making money from stories for free out of your brain. Nobody has to get hurt. Nobody has to get swindled. You can make a living from it, So, because that was the main thing they wanted to know was like, oh, you're an author. Oh, okay, how much money? How much do you make? That was the main thing that they were interested in, man. Yeah, but it's just to go with what you're saying of like you say, we have that luxury of being able to enjoy these stories because we're not out there getting fucking shot at, or gassed or whatever it is.
Well, that's why twats like Andrew Tate piss me off so much because they go in. Oh, I remember him having a video, something about he doesn't read fiction. Fiction's for kids, or it's stupid, or useless waste of time. I was like, no, it's fucking not.
No.
Like if you're actually reading and engaging in the work, it's very important, and it can shape your whole worldview. It can teach you about things like courage and overcoming. And I mean, I'm assuming he was being obtuse on purpose because that's his fucking brand. But if you really do believe that about fiction, I don't know. You must live a very pathetic, sad life,
Right.
a very monotone, boring life without any meaning. At least to me.
Right. I mean, look, the idea that somehow there's no value in a thing unless it really happened, like I would wager that almost anybody listening to this, right, on a Monday night, you come home from work. You're tired, right? You're bored. You put on a movie, right? Or you crack open a video game, right? Or you put on a podcast, whatever. That story, right? The way that people engage with the world when it's not their own existence is story. And the idea that this guy was in fucking jail, which, by the way, in a really hilarious way, goes after that fucking Greta Thunberg girl. She's like 12. And,
That was funny.
And he ends up getting arrested because he tweeted at her. Love it. He's in jail there, and you're telling me he's not reading any books? You're telling me he's just looking at the wall? Like, books matter most when you get your heart broken, or when you're in a fucking jail cell, right? Or when you're on a plane with nowhere to go. That's where stories matter most. Is in between you doing whatever you're doing with your life. You engage with existence through other people's engagement of existence, man. So it's like saying like existing is stupid. Right? Okay, cool, but you do. We're here, so you might as well fucking get on board with it. I mean, like you say, he's saying dumb shit for a living, so it's like he's wrong at the concept. So you can't even like. I mean, I heard him say that like high blood pressure is good because it means your like heart is beating in a masculine way. That's how it works, dude.
Well, I mean, if anyone ever took that guy seriously when he did that, would you rather have sex with Hulk Hogan with a pussy or I think it was Megan Fox with a penis? And he was like, you have to go with Hulk Hogan. I was like, okay, this guy's fucking like, come on. He laying on top of Hulk Hogan. Or no, I think he went with Megan Fox because the Hulk Hogan visual. But it's just like, why is that something you're thinking about? It's ridiculous.
I mean, like, is that not in itself a little fiction, right? Like, would you?
Well,
rather?
that's what I'm saying. Like, it goes back to just stories. It doesn't have to be a novel or a short story. Video games, movies. If you say you don't invite in any fiction, you do nothing.
You do
like,
nothing.
You're not. Even your imagination must not be working because I don't know about you guys. I'm always creating stories in my head,
right.
Even if I'm just sitting there doing, at a cafe or something. I'm creating stories. I'm watching somebody and I'm thinking, oh, what's their life like? What's happening? You're making up nonsense technically, but if you don't do that at all, like, what do you do? Are you just a robot? I don't understand.
I also
and
think
also,
yeah, sorry, man, go for it.
I was going to say a lot of people, you kind of already touched on this without saying it, but a lot of people say that the main source of learning what empathy is and learning to be a human being is through reading fiction, through reading other people's perspectives. And if you look at someone like Andrew Tate and the stuff that he creates, I mean, even if that's a character he plays, he's willing to play that character to the world.
Yeah.
And that, I mean, that alone tells me he probably really doesn't read that much fiction. So that's a problem.
He really has got that kind of sad clown persona, where he's just stuck with. That's you now for life, right? Like you can't now write a book about your memoirs or whatever. I mean, he probably could, but you know what I mean? Like nobody's going to take like the Andrew Tate novel seriously if he ever.
Well, isn't the gimmick he lives? Isn't that just in and of itself a form of fiction? Like,
right?
Because even if he's somewhat of a douche that, no one's actually like that's not that as a person. That's a gimmick. That's like a wrestling front. he's putting that on for shows. He could be like that to a degree, but like most of the talking heads and stuff in the media, that's not how they actually think. Because I've never met a real person that's like that. Like it just does. I've met a lot of racist people, a lot of misogynists, a lot of super hyper masculine dude bros, but none of them are actually to that degree ever.
No, but I think in his look, if he was really a fucking multi-millionaire and the rest of it, why does he need $800 from some losers on YouTube? Why does he need your money if he's so rich?
Exactly.
You know, like, look, beware the man who comes to you with black and white answers in life. Beware the man who says, life is simple, let me explain it to you. Life is grey. Life is complicated. So if you hear some fucking idiot saying, follow me, I can make America great again. Spoiler, life is complicated. You can't just snap your fingers and solve problems. That's not how it works. So the idea that this little fucking peanut head in Romania knows anything about anything. How many books have you read in your life to tell other people about life? Like, imagine the brass, imagine the balls you need, right, to genuinely think, I have advice for people I don't know, right? Like, oh, you want to know about women? Let me tell you about women. Like, mate, you've been charged for trafficking and raping people. I don't think you're the guy you're not fucking Casanova, pal. You know, like, I don't know. It's just, I think you are right. I think he probably doesn't genuinely inhabit that space. I think he does it for money. But like you said, Bryce, what a sad thing to pretend to be the clown, and now you have to be the clown for life. There's no leaving the circus. That's your brand. I mean, one counterpoint to Andrew Tate, kind of at the other end of the scale, in the UK for many years, we had Piers Morgan, the most insufferable man imaginable. I mean, to give you an example with him, there was a poll of top 10 most hated Arsenal fans. Arsenal is a football team in North London, and he's a big Arsenal fan. Top 10 most hated Arsenal fans amongst Arsenal supporters. Osama bin Laden was number 3. Piers Morgan was number 1, right? So, to some level, this is like tongue-in-cheek, right? But look, the point remains, that guy is sort of fairly universally despised. So if I'm Piers Morgan, I have to ask myself, the people who agree with my stupid opinions, do they genuinely love me? Or am I just saying the stuff that they already agree with? They don't really give a shit about me, but I'm just saying the stuff they like. They come to me for the echo chamber and the rest of it, right? I look at Andrew Tate there and I'm like, listen, pal, in a few years, when this is all said and done, man, nobody's going to be paying you $800 for your pimp HQ university or whatever it is you're selling, right? But you're still going to be that bald guy who said the racist shit, who did the whatever, right? That's you for life, man. It's no good. You can't write the Da Vinci Code and then 10 years down the line say, I want to write 100 Years of Solitude. That ship has sailed, man. You're the Da Vinci Code guy. Like, this is the stuff you do now. So when you see Dan Brown wearing a big tweed jacket with the elbow patches and he's trying to walk and talk like a Cambridge professor, you're like, yeah, cool, man, but you wrote the Da Vinci Code. So I don't know, man. I just think, like you say, if you are going to give yourself to the world as an author or an entertainer or whatever it is, the algorithm likes one thing, right? You've got to think about what your one thing is.
Yeah. Well, to circle back to video games and try to start wrapping this up.
Andrew Tate.
Yeah, that was fun though. But yeah, to start wrapping the show up, with all our guests, I like to ask, what was a book or a video game that reminded you of its counterpart? What's a video game that reminded you of a book, or what's a book that reminds you of a video game?
So, at the beginning, I thought I was going to talk about the Akira books, the manga, and talk about how Streets of Rage was a real kind of like interplay, or felt like a kind of interactivity of those stories to me. But we kind of touched on that. So I think going back to the kind of choose your own adventure, sword and sorcery world, that is kind of the door to me into literature. There was a game on the Mega Drive called Golden Axe.
Yeah. And
Golden Axe was kind of like a sword and sorcery version of Streets of Rage. Now, I'm not actually sure which one came first, but they have a lot in common. And there was this one particular mechanic you could do where you could, if things were getting really tight, you could hit, I think it was A, and then you would just pull off this magic and you would fuck up everyone on screen, right? And it was it's such an exaggerated graphic where like the whole fucking screen would be like fire or water or whatever it was, right? And it would just like, the feeling of being overpowered. As a kid, I remember looking up at that and being like, in my hand, I've got the very power of God, man. It was like the real kind of feeling of like, so yeah, reading those sword and sorcery, choose your own adventure books, like I'm talking really early, like however old I was, when I got to Golden Axe, it was so exciting for me because it felt like these are like these stories I love, but it's here on screen. And now it's rolling out in front of me. And I'm directly responsible, right? Like you can, the punches were like chunky, you know, like the feel of it. I mean, you know, the control pad wasn't vibrating, but the sort of feedback of it was so
right.
sort of tangible, man, that it felt like really like the kind of marriage between those books I had loved and that game. And it was reached a point as well where like I think the difficulty gradient was really good. It wasn't like easy, brutal. It was like I think it sort of built in a really nice way. Yeah, man. So nobody ever really talks about Golden Axe anymore, but I think it's one of those, or at least not that I'm aware of. But it's just such a classic. And the music was great, and like the characters were cool, right? You got this real kind of like Conan the Barbarian feeling type main character. He's got the sword, the animations were great, and it was just really kind of like firing up that game. It felt as if I was looking at these sprites and graphics that I'd already kind of been to in my imagination through those Steve Jackson books, through those kind of sorcery books, man. So yeah, I would say that. Because for me, just for the bare fact alone, that was really kind of the beginning for me. And I think Golden Axe is maybe 1989, right? So I was born in 84, so I'm like coming to that at like 6. By the time I'm playing it, I'm like 6 or 7, man. So, which is probably too young to be like chopping people up with swords and shit, but you know.
Yeah, I actually just watched. I was trying to watch a because I don't know all that. I don't have that much direct experience with Sega. I think the only Sega thing we had growing up was the Game Gear, and so I was just curious, and I went back and looked at like a an overview of the Sega console history and the games that were the big games on each one. And Golden Axe was one that always comes up. And I was looking at the video of the gameplay, and I was
Still
like, man,
holds
we
up
gotta,
pretty well too.
yeah, we got to do an episode on that sometime. It looks really awesome. I'm really
It's funny as well because much like Streets of Rage, I think there's like maybe 2 or 3 of them, and the premise never changes, right? It's still a side scroller, and it's basically a beat 'em up. But I think it's a classic because it's basically inhabiting that space of, oh, you like side scrolling beat 'em ups? Well, you've got that, but also like this is like in a fantasy world. And a lot of those beat 'em ups are often happening in just like, there are a lot of Streets of Rage clones. And I'm like I say, I'm not sure if this comes before or after or around the same time, but this really felt like sort of fresh because I remember, for example, you could get on a dragon for a while and you could fucking run around on a dragon and like hit people, bite them and stuff like that. I don't know, man. Like there's a really good, I think it's maybe 3 of them. And stuff like if you time it in certain ways, you can hit someone and they fall off and they go like down the cliff or they go down a hole. And there was a real like, as a kid, when you timed that right, you were like, bon voyage, motherfucker, enjoy that. You felt so like, it's such a rewarding experience, man. But those Golden Axe games are so great. And like you say, man, if you fire them up now, of course, it's doing the same thing for the whole game, but it's done so well. It's such a simple, beautiful pleasure.
Yeah. I guess last question, unless Caleb has anything else, but I'm just curious. I mean, you've talked about actually playing The Last of Us. Since you're a busy novelist nowadays, do you still play stuff now?
I do, but so I have a PS5, and I do sort of like dip in and out. my go-to is I play FIFA because I'm a football fan or a soccer fan, as you would say. So I dip into FIFA and I play that. And the nice thing there is that it's like a 6-minute burst.
Yeah.
Right? So even if you have like an hour session or whatever, in theory, if I wanted, I could just do the 6 minutes and then leave again, right? I'm not like, I have my feelings about Electronic Arts and I have my feelings about the franchises and the rest of it. But that's just one that I've been with for so long and it's just a habit and you kind of go with it. But funnily enough, the games I tend to play outside of that tend to be, I'll go back to classics, usually, right? For example, I think the last thing I downloaded was the Duke Nukem 3D, right?
Oh, right.
And I remember, having that on the PC, absolutely loving that and stuff. And it's it's hit and miss. Sometimes you remember a thing being absolutely stellar and you think this can't have aged. And then you play it and you're like, yeah, this is trash. Obviously it's old, but that's kind of baked into the cake. It's old, right? But it can still stand up. And then other times, man, you play something and you're just like, yeah, like this is, not only do I love this, but now I kind of appreciate it in a new way with new eyes, In fact, recently there's been this re-release of the old Tomb Raider games that they kind of like remastered. And the thing I found interesting about that is just reading about it was that you have the option, if you press a button, to switch in to exactly how they used to be. And then you hit the button and it switches into, it kind of walks and talks like it used to be. But what they tried to do was get to a place where you remember it like this and it's still good versus when you press the button, this is exactly as it was and it's bad, right? Not bad, but like tank controls and it looks bad and the rest of it, right? And I just think that's a really interesting space of like, the reality versus the nostalgia. And, I'm a big nostalgia guy. So yeah, that's a lot of, it's these old ones, man. Sometimes you think, I just want to be like 9 years old again. Ah, there you go. Michael Jackson's Moonwalker. Go back to that.
Right. Well, you have anything else, Caleb?
I think I'm all talked out.
All right. Well, this was really fun. If our listeners have enjoyed listening to us talk with Nick, he's coming back to Arcade Bookshop in the future. We have plans to talk about a very popular video game that may or may not have been talked about a lot in this episode.
Michael Jackson's Moonwalker. Spoiler.
Yes.
that'd be fun.
So that's in the near-ish future. So thank you everyone for listening to Arcade Bookshop, and thank you for being here, Nick. Everybody check out his writing, the Inspector Iwata novel series, starting with Bluelight Yokohama. Anything else you want to plug before we sign off?
I have a new book coming out in November. It's called The Sugar Man, and it's about children going missing in a small American town near an Amish village. Available in all good bookshops and some bad ones too.
Nice. I would be interested in that because you were talking a little bit before we started, but I went to Kutztown University, which is like in the middle of the Amish area, like the so that'd be interesting to read. But yeah, thanks again for being here, and thank you everybody for listening. As always, you should do as we do: keep a controller in one hand and a book in the other. I gotta stop doing that.
I don't know why you do that every episode.